This video is brought to you by Long Live the Emperor. Hello noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and the title of this video is based on a question that I have been asked quite a few times. Were the ancient Romans evil? Now, it is no secret that I am a Rome fanboy, and there are many out there among you who I'm sure can relate. The thing is that someone who loves the Romans is someone who really likes studying the historical period, loves the art, the architecture, appreciates the organizational skills, phenomenal logistics, the efficacy in battle of the Roman legions, the impressive technological and architectural feats that they have achieved, such as the construction of an extensive system of aqueducts and roads, as well as the construction of large monuments, palaces and public facilities, and learning about their myths, legends and gods. The young are also drawn into appreciating Rome because of the media in the form of popular films and video games. Roman armor looks great, and let's not even get into how authoritative and powerful their language, Latin, sounded. And if you want to hear fluently spoken Latin pronounced with the reconstructed classical pronunciation, then I would refer you to this video that I've recently made, which is in Latin, spoken in a way that will be consistent and very historically accurate with the way they spoke it. Link in the description below. But simply because we like studying, reenacting or playing as the Romans, it doesn't mean that we like everything about them or everything that they did. There are certain things that the Romans did that I would say 99% of modern people would find unacceptable, and some of the things we will examine together on this video are in fact very disturbing. Hence the question, were the ancient Romans evil? But does this question even make sense? This question, in a way, is being fueled by the media, because our mediatic entertainment has got us used to seeing clear distinctions of good and evil in any given story. Films and TV series need, for story writing purposes, a distinct hero and villain. The Romans have been represented as the evil power, for instance in the TV series Barbarians, which shows the story from the perspective of the Germanic tribes, trying to relay a tale of, open quotes, freedom and liberty of noble barbarians against the evil Roman yoke, close quotes. I made 5 videos about the TV series and I ultimately appreciated it, but real history is seldomly that black and white, and in a way we can see a similar dichotomy or contrasting division of roles in Star Wars, with the rebels being the good guys and the Empire being clearly and undeniably evil. Sure, the Romans were brutal, that is a fact. Germania, however, wasn't some sort of free utopia before the arrival of the Romans. Many of the Germanic tribes hated each other, probably as much as they hated the Empire. There was no one German nation, and it only took a decade or so for Arminius' confederation to fall apart after a Roman campaign of retribution, and he was then assassinated by members of his own tribe. The case in point being, let's not treat history the way we would treat a story. With all of that in mind, can the question be answered, or is it fundamentally flawed? I'll attempt an unbiased answer, but we need to define a few factors: the subject of our analysis, the Romans, and the determining attribute in question, evil. Clearly by Romans we don't mean the general population. Thinking every single Roman was evil would be silly. You have good people and bad people everywhere. Our analysis deals with the Romans as a civilization and with their central power and authorities. The word evil is where the situation becomes more complicated. Now, probably the term evil isn't the most scientifically appropriate term to be used in this discussion, but I think we can still have an interesting exchange of ideas. Now, normally on this channel we deal with facts, but in this case we aren't talking about facts alone, precisely because we are bringing the term evil into the equation. Rather than dealing with facts alone, we are now dealing with the relations that hold between them. Another important thing is that we need to try and apply suitable standards, but I'll get to that in a minute. So, what is evil? We could define as evil something that is immoral. Yet morality changes over the centuries, and even today, the principles concerning the distinction between right and wrong or good and bad behavior, the principles of conduct, are conflicted between people who hold different views. The extent to which an action is right or wrong can depend on your view, which is often influenced by your place of origin, your upbringing, level of education, personal experiences, and many other factors, internal and external. It is in fact very hard to define a morality that could be accepted universally by all. Some basic things, sure, but the more complex and detailed it becomes, the more room for different opinions we will have. So probably the best way to define evil is to go to its fundamental core and define it as anything that is harmful to the survival and procreation of an individual in a given group, as that is most likely how morality in its most basic form began in hunter-gatherer societies. For a more linguistic definition, we can say that evil, in a general sense, is defined by what it is not good, or the opposite or absence of good. Another possible definition could be profound immorality and wickedness. This is all relevant because we are trying to pinpoint an actual definition for evil before we try and attribute it to the Romans. And we have just said that linguistically speaking, the term evil is intertwined with lack of morality. So it is important to understand what morality is and how it originated in order for us to understand what we mean by evil. Collectively, group living requires cooperation and can generate conflict. Social living puts strong evolutionary selection pressures on acquiring social intelligence due to the fact that living in groups has advantages such as protection from predators and the fact that groups in general outperform the sum of an individual's performance. Disgust, one of the basic emotions, may have an important role in certain forms of morality. Disgust is argued to be a specific response to certain things or behaviors that are dangerous or undesirable from an evolutionary perspective. One example is things that increase the risk of an infectious disease, such as spoiled foods, dead bodies, other forms of microbiological decomposition, poor hygiene, and we already covered this in my previous video. But another example of behaviors that may threaten group cohesion or cooperation, such as cheating, lying, and stealing, may generate disgust. Studies have found that such situations activate areas in the brain associated with disgust. Now that we understand the basics of morality, we can expand the term survival into meaning the achievement of a satisfactory, well-lived life, and we can expand the term group to mean humanity. Anything that goes against this, we could term evil for the purposes of our assessment. Alright, in the next section of this video we're going to make a list and talk about all of those negative things that are usually associated with the Romans, such as murder, genocide, slavery, and whatnot. We will discuss the definitions, see if they actually did them, and then try to look at them through the eyes of Roman legislation, so Roman law. But before doing that, I'd like to mention the sponsor that made this video possible, Long Live the Emperor. Long Live the Emperor is a graphic novel set in the fantasy realm of Orlan. I've already spoken about this graphic novel on this channel once, and I'm really happy to be able to do that again because it's really good. As you can see, the ebook that you can order has really beautiful art, very colorful, but what really sets it aside, apart from the story, is the fact that it was written by Jaron P. Green, who is both a HEMA practitioner and a noble one. Because of his understanding of historical European martial arts, the combat in this novel is actually realistic, it makes sense, it's based on real combat. And when you look at actual battle scenes, they are based on an overall deep study and understanding of the art of war by Sun Tzu. And when Jaron finished this book, he was only 19, which is commendable. Now, because Jaron is also a noble one, he decided to make a special offer to the noble ones, and the first 300 people to order Long Live the Emperor through the link in the description below will get a 25% off. And by purchasing this novel, you're also supporting my channel because I am getting a percentage of each sale, which I think was important for me to underline. So what are you waiting for? Link in the description below. Take this opportunity to get a very good graphic novel either for you or for your friends at a very good price because of the discount. And by doing so, you will be supporting my work here on YouTube. And with the sales of these ebooks, Jaron is going to complete his suit of armor, which I think of course is something that we can all appreciate. Thank you so much, Geron, and long live the Emperor, for supporting the Metatron's channel. Alright, in this section of the video we're going to talk about the things that of course are negative that are usually associated to the Romans, and we'll try to understand if first of all they actually did it, because not all the things that are usually associated to the Romans are real, and we'll put some context so that we try and understand why certain things were done, and most importantly how they were done. And even though some of the things that we're going to describe now are undeniably horrible and evil, we also have to understand that some of these things do have a place in the actual period as they are contextualized in their time. Let's begin with the first one: violence. Were the ancient Romans violent? Yes, the ancient Romans were a violent civilization. There is no doubt about it. What's important to say though is, again, this needs to be contextualized to its time. In fact, it's probably one of those, we could say, accusations towards the Romans that holds less water. Everyone was violent back then. And to a certain degree, people are very violent even today. The concept of living a life completely free of violence is an absolute beautiful goal that we can have as a human civilization, and hopefully as we reach levels of type 1 civilization or perhaps even type 2 civilization, then we will have found a way to live our lives completely rid of violence. It isn't the case now. It definitely wasn't the case in the 20th century with the 2 world wars that we had, and so it clearly wasn't the case in the times of classical antiquity. The ancient world was very brutal, and it was common that only the strongest survived. As we take the traditional date 21st of April 753 BC as the foundation and beginning of Rome, we know that the Romans were originally a warrior society that valued strength and courage. At this time, things such as compassion were considered a sign of weakness. The empire was a military dictatorship. There is no other way to look at it if we really want to be realistic about it. If you tried to fight against the empire, if you were a threat to the power and institution, the authorities will have terminated you. But even during the Republic, and even before during the Kingdom, things weren't all flowery and dandy. Rome expanded. And that is one of the characteristics of most forms of classical governmental bodies. Now, of course, there is a difference between a kingdom and an empire, and I will dedicate a full video onto this, but generally speaking, we know that the Romans expanded through war, which means violently. But when Rome was created at the very beginning of its birth, you have to imagine that it was surrounded by ferocious lions. Those were the powers that Rome had around it. Any town or starting civilization that had decided to go for peace and love at the time would have been either conquered or wiped out. Of course, you could argue that then perhaps they could have just defended themselves and they didn't need to wage wars of conquest. But the problem is that if you think about the First Punic War, the Second Punic War, when Rome and Carthage fought, and then ultimately Rome winning that fight, if Rome hadn't grown, if Rome hadn't expanded its territories, becoming more powerful and stronger, Carthage would have conquered it, and the Romans would have been wiped out once again. So unfortunately for classical governments, it was a need to expand. Given. Big fish eat little fish, as simple as that. Another important thing is that a strong economy is the basis of a powerful and strong army. Not armor, not weapons, not tactics. These things are incredibly important ingredients, but without a stable economical backbone, no army will ever win a war. I know that this might sound as, well, everybody did it, so it's okay, and that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying we need to contextualize it in its time. Also, the Romans' love for violence has been exasperated quite a lot. For example, gladiatorial combat and gladiators fighting are always shown as an example of the Romans being bloodthirsty and just enjoying random violence, but that's been exaggerated, as I say, because the majority of gladiatorial fights were not to death. It was a form of combat entertainment, and we do have forms of combat entertainment in our day. I mean, UFC or any sort of MMA, it's quite brutal, and perhaps from the point of view of people 600 years from now or 1,000 years from now, those would look barbaric, violent and completely useless, which means that we are really not in any position to judge the Romans for enjoying gladiatorial combat. Now, given there were some extremes, such as slaves having to fight against beasts and being devoured by those beasts, but we do have records that underline the fact that even the condemnations of the Christians, for example, during the reign of Nero, were frowned upon by the population, and they thought that they were exaggerated. And bringing back the discussion on the gladiators, we do know that gladiatorial combat was expensive, training gladiators was very expensive, and so the idea of thousands and tens of thousands of gladiators were killed every single time that there was a game is absolutely moronic as a statement, because it just would collapse the entirety of the ludus, the schools where the gladiators were training, the champions that people loved to see. So yes, it was a violent form of entertainment, but it wasn't as deadly. Occasionally you would have people die, but it wasn't as deadly as people think. And we do have violent forms of entertainment in our day and age. The next point is murder. Now, we can agree that murder is a horrible thing. The thing is that it really also depends on the context, meaning that murdering another individual is always a horrible thing, but you have to imagine that if it's a person who is just randomly killing someone else, then yes, that's a crime, it's an evil thing, and the person needs to be put away. However, if it's a father defending his daughter from a criminal who wants to kidnap his kid, is trying to kidnap his kid, and the father starts fighting against this criminal, he kills him, I would say that's a completely different thing. And then again, it very much will depend on the context. Self-defense justifies murder in certain cases. In fact, it probably doesn't even count as murder. But the idea of killing someone else really depends. And in the case of the Romans, they did have very precise laws on how to deal with murder. So it was considered a crime. Now, of course, when you say, a lot of people say, yeah, but the Romans murdered the populations that they conquered. And I understand that from our perspective, that looks like a really difficult thing to understand. But then again, look at the 20th century. How many people died during the First and Second World War? Thing is, though, that people die all the time and are killed all the time in war. It's a horrible thing, but unfortunately it is part of human society. And as I said at the very beginning of this section, hopefully one day we will get rid entirely of wars, but right now wars are there. Even in the 20th century we have had many wars, and even though the concept of killing during war is a horrible thing, we can all agree to that, we can also say that the soldiers who had to kill in order to stop Hitler having to kill his soldiers, in that case we understand it as a casualty, something that is part of war. And from the point of view of the Romans, conquering and expanding was a necessity. It was something you had to do, and therefore, even though I'm not excusing it, I am just contextualizing it in its time. Slavery. Did the Romans have slaves? Yes, they had a lot of slaves. Everybody else did, I'd like to underline. It is very, very few countries, we shouldn't really use the term countries, but states, cities, towns and kingdoms, empires that didn't have slaves. So yes, the Romans did have slaves, lots of people did as well. But it's important to say that for the Romans, the numbers are really, really crazy. So the way that they did that in the case of the Romans, but I want to say in the case of many other empires as well, is that they would conquer other nations or land with the intentions to use the native people as resources to help the mother country in any way possible. That is what is usually called imperial hegemony. The Roman Empire based its economy on slavery and the loot that you would get from conquered lands. So because of that, the empire itself was constantly hungry for more and more slaves. However, it is also important again for context to underline the fact that slavery was only abolished in, generally speaking, most European countries in 1833 and in 1865 in America. So if we consider the Romans evil for using slavery, then there are a lot of other powers, states, nations and countries and kingdoms and systems that we should also consider evil. In fact, probably the majority. Another one that is often attributed to the Romans is the term genocide. The Romans committed genocide and therefore they were absolutely evil, much more than many other civilizations. But did they really commit genocide? Well, let's go and check the actual definition of the term, both from a linguistic and a legal standpoint. The Romans are usually accused to have committed genocide against Carthage in 146 BC. Usually genocide is defined as a mass extermination of a particular group of people. But behind this simple definition there is a complicated tangle of legal concepts that we'll try to go through very quickly now. The term was created in 1943 by the Jewish-Polish lawyer Raphael Lemkin, and this was after witnessing the horrors of the Holocaust. And it was in December 1948 that the term genocide was accepted under international law during the United Nations Genocide Convention, which came into effect in January 1951. This is what Article 2 defines genocide as: any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial or religious group as such, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Now, the UN has come under criticism from different sides because of the fact that either the definition is too narrow or that the term has been devalued by overuse. In light of this actual definition, then, we could say that what happened with Carthage was war, not a genocide, for the following reasons. Even though the war between the Carthaginians and the Romans was extremely bloody and many people died on both sides, as a cause of Rome 3 years siege of the world's wealthiest city, Carthage. Out of a population of 400,000, at least 150,000 Carthaginians perished according to the numbers that we are given, although it is possible that these numbers were exaggerated. Appian described a battle in which 70,000, including non-combatants, were killed. Again, probably an exaggeration. Polybius, who participated in the campaign, confirmed that the number of deaths was incredibly large. In 146, Roman legions under Scipio Aemilianus razed the city and dispersed into slavery the 55,000 survivors, including 25,000 women. But it was not a war of quote-unquote racial extermination. The Romans did not massacre the survivors, nor the adult males. Although the Romans did destroy 5 allied African cities of the Punic culture, they spared 7 other towns which had defected to them. So, did the Romans commit genocide? Didn't the Romans commit genocide? It very much depends on how we interpret the term genocide, which is a 20th century term. So in my opinion, even though the atrocity of the war was horrible, that is because war is horrible. But at the end of the day, Hannibal had been a bane for Rome for a very long time, about 14 years, which is something that not many people know. That's how long Hannibal was able to stay within Italy and plunder the territory. And that doesn't justify Rome's response, but they were enemies at war. In my opinion, this does not qualify for genocide. But I would like to hear your opinion in the comments below. For the next one, we are going to look into Roman law a bit more in details, both during the Republican time and during the Imperial time. But another thing that is often used to accuse the Romans is the fact that they would liberally use something that I can't really use the word for, because if I do, my entire video will be demonetized. So it's a 4-letter word starting with an R to represent the idea of, for example, a man forcing himself sexually onto a woman or another man or a child for that matter. So I can't use the word, but you know that if I say 4-letter word, that's what I'm referring to. So is it true that the Romans just did that deliberately all the time? It wasn't considered a problem. In fact, it was often used as a form of punishment or a form to show someone that you were dominant? No. Let's have a look what Roman law tells us about it. Now, in Latin, there is no single word to describe the act of unlawful sexual activity with a person, without consent, either by force, threat, or injury. In fact, such act would be covered by multiple legal terms. They had charges of seduction, attempted seduction, adultery, abduction, ravishment, but it was seen as a form of crime. However, saying that the Romans did whatever they wanted and there would be no repercussion is incorrect. Having pointed this out, however, there are some things concerning this matter that we would definitely frown upon, and I'm going to tell you about them. So, the act itself was considered a crime. So the idea of the Romans did whatever they wanted and they didn't consider it a crime is incorrect. But it is also important to say that there are some characteristics about legal fabric of how certain cases were addressed that we would definitely frown upon. So let's have a look at the sources. For the Romans, all sexual assault was treated as a crime, but the legal charge is not always as easily definable. In the majority of cases, if you were a Roman citizen and one of your, say, daughters or perhaps your wife or your son were attacked or assaulted sexually, in the majority of cases, the Roman law would allow you to take revenge. And oftentimes that revenge would be either castrating the criminal or to actually kill him. This was allowed in Roman law. During the Republican era, the situation went even beyond that, because even if the father of a daughter who had received a sexual assault were to pardon the perpetrator, the state still wouldn't, and a punishment wouldn't be inflicted. The part that we would frown upon is that all of this would only work for citizens of Rome. In order for the law to protect you, you needed to fit within a specific social structure and status. And of course, the higher your status, the more protection you would have. The lower your status, the more it didn't matter. The less of a repercussion there could be. And if you were a slave, you had basically no rights. So it was in fact the right of your master, being your owner, to use you sexually, and they wouldn't even see it as sexual assault. That, of course, is absolutely horrible. It is also possible that even though, generally speaking, legionaries were clearly discouraged, so the military was discouraged to do any sort of sexual harassment, and legionaries would be punished and sometimes even sentenced to death during times of peace, during times of war, the situation would be different, because you have to imagine that while the Romans were conquering a village and they were plundering and murdering everybody, I doubt that any law of containment would be actually applied, because then again, someone who is not a Roman citizen wasn't considered to be part of the legal system, therefore they had no rights. This is unfortunately something that we should probably condemn, about the reason being that many cultures have done this, probably all cultures have done this. Don't kid yourself, even in the most recent wars, and probably in all wars on this planet, there are people who took advantage of the weak, who took advantage of the situation in which they were on, from all points of view. So really, what we should condemn in this case, yes, it's the legal system of the Romans, although for the time, the fact that at least it protected women and children was already something that we should praise, because that was not common in other places. But it was still far from being a perfect utopia where everything is done fairly and correctly. Public executions are another of those really gruesome things about the Romans, and of course again they are present in other cultures, but what the Romans did was particularly strong, if you wish, and they were used for a specific purpose. They were absolutely horrible, and they were done to ensure control through fear. So sometimes they were done to punish criminals and crimes, but other times they were done to simply crush rebellions, for example, or anything that would threaten the central power. But still keep in mind the date 30th of May 1431. That's when Joan of Arc, at the age of 19, was burnt at the stake by the ecclesiastical authorities. Again, not something that only the Romans did. Alright, so in conclusions, were the Romans evil? Well, the real question should be, are humans evil? Because at the end of the day, when you look at what the Romans did and all the things that the Romans did that we have looked at today, these are things that mankind has unfortunately always done. I think the only reasons why we tend to focus, or some people tend to focus on the Romans and say, oh, but the Romans were particularly evil, is simply because the Romans were particularly effective at what they were doing, and they were particularly good at doing what they were doing, which kind of influences our perception. But at the end of the day, the important thing to say is that Rome did have some good rulers. Not all Roman emperors were complete psychopath, megalomaniac psychopath. We have to imagine that Rome also did many good things, and even though if we try to scale on the balance of civilization goodness, if something like that happens, you might still get too many bad things as compared to the good things. It is also important to remember again to contextualize in its time and try not to be hypocrite, because again, 20th century, 2 world war with millions of deaths and an Holocaust. So to me, when we look at the bad things that civilizations such as the Romans did, it shouldn't really be a situation to simply point the finger and say, oh, they were evil, horrible. But it would be a great opportunity to try and understand what things as a modern society we should change as we try and strive to reach to finally a type 1 civilization, a type 2 civilization, and hopefully a civilization that will have no war and famine, unjust treatment of people, and all of that. This is of course just my opinion, which is what I share on my channel, but I'm always looking forward to hear what you think in the comments below. As always, thanks to the sponsors of this video, Long Live the Emperor, and again, check out the link in the description below. If you haven't, it's a great opportunity to get a good graphic novel. Thank you very much for watching, and if you enjoy these kind of discussions, please leave a comment, let me know what you think. I do read the comments, I love interacting with you, I learn a lot from you, and become a member of this awesome community. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.